Hello, beautiful beings. This message is for all of you who work so hard and have such high standards for yourselves, and you want so much for others. And sometimes that can be very painful when you don't meet your goals or things don't unfold as you had intended. I was recently reading a book called 10x is Easier Than 2x by Dr. Benjamin Hardy and Coach Dan Sullivan. And he's been coaching for 50 years and lots of experience with high achievers and powerful, successful entrepreneurs. It was recommended to me repeatedly, and finally I listened and took it in through the audiobook, which I highly recommend because there are interviews between uh, Ben and Dan, which are enlightening and fascinating information. So yes, the audiobook. In my experience, having very high standards and wanting so much for myself and the others that I work with, it used to be really painful for me to set goals. And in fact, I avoided setting goals at all costs because the disappointment was felt excruciating. And then I learned over time that it wasn't about achieving the goal. The importance was setting a goal so that there was something to move towards. And that at last I understood that any movement towards the goal was a success. And many times I was very close to achieving it, or in fact, I did achieve it once I relaxed into this whole goal intention process. And um, through the personal work that I've done, I've learned not to compare myself to others because that just brings suffering in my experience. However, in this book, 10x is easier than 2x, Dan noticed in working with all these high achieving entrepreneurs is that a lot of them were suffering. So even though from the outside they looked very successful, on the inside they were dissatisfied and uh, even suffering because they weren't meeting their goals. And so, because they didn't meet the goal or the ideal, as I spoke of in the beginning, they felt like a failure. And so he coined these concepts of living in the gap or living in the gain. And so living in the gap is when we are constantly looking at what we haven't done, what we didn't finish, what goals we didn't reach, and putting all our time and attention on these failures. So from the outside, it looks like we're successful because we've achieved all these wonderful things. But on the inside, because we haven't achieved our end goal or the ideal that we were reaching for, we inside are suffering. And I can relate to that. I can relate as in the past being someone who was very hard on myself and beat myself up quite a bit. And certainly it was reflected to me by others that from the outside it looked like I was doing very well. However, inside I was dissatisfied. I felt like a failure. I was choking on disappointment. And so this is living in the gap. And uh, living in the gain is when we are able to claim our successes and embody them and enjoy them and celebrate them, which all of you that have seen me post in the past, celebrating our successes, celebrating my own successes is something that I do regularly, and I invite others to do it often as well. What my aha was between living in the gap or living in the gain is I had taught myself not to compare myself to others. I had taught myself to celebrate my successes. However, internally, I was still reaching for ideals. And when I wasn't meeting these ideals of truth or love, like the ideal of love, I was feeling less than. Dr. Benjamin, who is writing this book in collaboration with Dan, reminds us that ideals are meant to inspire us, and that the ideal will always keep moving forward. And so it's like trying to reach the horizon, is the analogy he uses. The horizon is constantly moving and you're never going to meet it. And meeting it isn't the point. It's reaching for the ideal. It is striving for it. It is improving your capacity, increasing your abilities, opening your heart more and more and more. That really landed with me, is that part of my suffering is that I had been measuring myself against these ideals which are not ever going to be reached. And so I was like, oh, that was a huge aha. And then the other major aha from uh, living in the gain is, rather than comparing myself to these ideals, which, in the past I was falling short, what Dan recommends is that you only ever compare yourself to you. So compare yourself to yourself behind you. So compare yourself to you in the past. Compare yourself to you yesterday, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. And then it becomes obvious how much you've changed, how much improvement has occurred, how much growth, how much success. And this is living in the gain. Simple, right? Simple. It's a simple concept. I compare myself to the me, the iteration of myself I used to be. And in making that simple shift from comparing myself to an ideal or comparing myself to others, I compare myself to a past iteration of myself, and therefore my success becomes obvious. And my growth becomes easier to articulate, and my improvement is simpler to identify. And so I invite you all to take time to contemplate where you've come from and how far you have come in this, whatever context, year, 3 years, 10 years, 3 months, whatever it is, and enjoy life in the game.